Welcome to the 4 p.m. session of Track 3, Craft and Community, entitled She Sells Short Stories. Before we begin, 1455 would like to thank our sponsors and panelists for their support and participation in the 2021 1455 Summer Festival. As a reminder, audience members are in listen-only mode. Chat and the QA functions are not available. But we do encourage you to keep these conversations going via social media. 1455 is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Also, please note that every summer festival session is being recorded and will be available for on-demand replay in the 1455 Attendee Hub a few hours after session conclusion. Lastly, in the event you encounter technical difficulties viewing this session, we suggest either reloading the page or clicking the back button on your browser and then rejoining the session. Now I'd like to turn the session over to our speakers to get started. Thank you and enjoy the session.
Thank you for joining us for this session entitled She Sells Short Stories. We are very happy you could be with us today as part of the 1455 Summer Festival hosted by 1455 Literary Arts. We are here to talk about short stories with three incredible writers. Dantiel Moniz, author of Milk, Blood, Heat. Amber Sparks, author of The Unfinished World and Other Stories. And Lydia Yuknovich, author of Verge. It's wonderful to be speaking with you all today. I loved and admired all three of your collections, which are so different from one another, but which share this tremendous emotional energy, as well as the really remarkable ability to suggest whole, complex, fully realized worlds in a very compressed form. I write short stories myself also, and I guess, for that reason, I wanted to begin by asking you to talk a little about the process of writing a short story. What comes to you first? How do you know when you have the germ of a new story? And also, the question just as key and perhaps even more difficult to answer, how do you know when a story is complete? I won't say finished, but complete. Where does it begin?
I can jump in.
Yeah.
So, I always talk a lot about structure when I talk about short stories. And I think about structure kind of obsessively when I'm writing, specifically short stories. And for me, this is probably a little bit weird, but I can't actually start writing a story until I have the very specific narrative structure and I know exactly how I'm going to write it. Even if I'll have characters or I'll have, plot points or ideas or thoughts, things that I want to write about desperately. And sometimes I'll have to have them sort of percolating for years until I find the exact form for the story. And then it's just, for me, that makes it click.
Yeah, I'll go. So for me, structure is a thing that I still think happens a little bit unconsciously for me. It's something that I have to think more about, like what that looks like for me. But I think what is similar in my process and Amber's process is that incubation period. I do what I call collecting seeds. So like an idea or an image or something will come into me and I just put it in my phone and it exists there. And then after a while, it's like another image will come and my brain starts connecting like, oh, these things might be connected. Let's move them into a folder. Now they might be in the same world or story or whatever it is. But usually, no matter if it's an image or an idea or characters, usually I know what comes to me first about a story is the ending. And I guess in a structural way, I like cyclical stories. So for me, I like that touch point, that kind of looping back. So maybe that's what the structure is for me. But yeah, usually it's an ending and then whatever it is that I just can't get out of my mind.
Oh, I'm already experiencing some nerd glee. I mean, in regular life, I just don't get to sit around and talk about, craft or structure or story as much. And so I just basking in nerd glee. Thank you for including me. I love what's been said already, and I know those feelings too. I think for me personally, short stories are very specifically for me like puzzle boxes. And what I mean by that is there are these smaller little boxes within boxes, and what compels me to move to write a story is that there's a character who is probably haunting me, or following me around, like I can't get the idea of them out of my head, and B, they have material conditions around them that are, if not impossible, at least problematic. Some kind of impossible place that a character is situated. And that makes me want to treat the story like a puzzle box and like either write a way out for them or write the impossibility of a way out for them, or, some kind of vibrating tension. That the short story is just beautiful as a form, the way it's already been spoken about, because you can make a vibrating tension for a short amount of time and reveal, these internal tensions of a character. And I'm only drawn to characters who are fucked up in some way, or just not, yeah, not quite right, or treated as such.
Yeah.
And I've just stopped writing about anyone else. But I do love how the form, as you're saying, both of you, it brings a clarity and a kind of shape that novels just drive you insane with their endless.
Oh, so big.
Yeah, that's why I'm like this.
I think with short stories, I'm so interested too in like what a short story gives you, but then you can kind of like sense the space around that short story. And that's actually my favorite thing about it, is that like, the story kind of lives off of the page in these ways that a lot of people, I guess, find really upsetting. Like, you know what I mean? Like people will be like, I wanted more, but I'm like, no, that's in your head. That's like for you to like go grasp. Yeah.
Yeah, like a moment.
Yeah.
Like something captured, like, nobody says of a snapshot, where's the rest of the story?
Yeah. What happened after, like, I want to see the moment after this. It's like,
yeah.
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 No, that's totally true. It's funny too, because of course, ironically, I'm writing a novel now, and like I find myself constantly wanting to be back in that space with short stories, because like with the novel, I keep finding myself going, oh, do I have to explain like how this character got from here to there?
Oh my God, moving them to different rooms. Oh my goodness.
Right. Like how much detail do I have to go into? Because with the story, it's you're right. It's like, I love all the open space around. That's a beautiful way to describe it, because you don't feel, you can talk about whatever you want to talk about in the short story, and you don't have to talk about any of the getting from point A to point B, or how this happened or how that happened. I mean, a few things, but for the most part, yeah, it's so much more, I want to say snapshotty, but there is more of that quality to it, which or more of that mystery around it, I guess, which is nice.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to hear you all speak about this difference between the short story and the novel, because it was actually, as it happens, the very next question that I had wanted to put to you, and so I wonder, maybe we could stay on this for a little while, because I think, I mean, there's the obvious difference of the length, but then, I mean, as you're sort of starting to get into. There are other differences between the short story and the novel form that are kind of caused by that, right? Like how, and I think particularly because all of you, I mean, the work of yours I'm familiar with, the stories are not limited in time by their length, right? Like all of you have stories in the collections I've read that really take place over a very long period of time, and so I'm interested, in maybe, sort of hearing you continue to talk about, especially, those who are in the middle of writing something longer form, like how is the process different, right? And how does it feel different? I mean, there's the geography, the moving people from room to room, which is difficult in the novel, and there's a lot of it. What else is strikes you as the difference between those two forms of fiction?
I don't, it's funny because I don't, this is very, it seems counterintuitive, but I feel like for me, the short story, I mean, you mentioned the sort of length of time or the span. And it's funny because I think, I swear to God, the longer the story, or especially in a novel in particular, I find that the shorter is the length of period of time that it actually takes place in. Like I like to tell stories, like, even just flash fiction or very brief fiction that's takes place over, like, centuries. But I find working on a novel that it's actually been easier for me to tell a story that takes place in the span of a few days. Which I know is weird, but it's almost like this sort of thing, that the space that you're exploring as you're sort of expanding certain elements. It's, to me, I find that I'm expanding elements of character in particular. And so that kind of stuff is more easily explored in like a smaller actual space of time. I don't know if for others that's true.
I'm gonna let Lydia go first because I'm
Okay. I love what you were saying. That was a really cool answer. There are lots of books that do that with time, though, and the novel is such a great vehicle for doing this with time. So that's one kind of answer. But I think my particular weirdness is that I write eternally in fragments, like waves of fragments. And when they locate on a single character, as I was describing earlier, in a predicament that I want to rattle the tension of, they become short stories. And when the fragments won't stop and they start turning into more than one person, the fragments turn into a novel. So it's sort of, my creative process is sort of loyal to literary fragmentation, but then some of them need, and here's a different way to answer it, epic space. And epic could mean anything you want it to mean, but a distortion of space that takes you out of the moment or out of the predicament and into, the motion and dynamic of time and space. Those seem like, the time and space of the novel are inhabited by that kind of epic stretching and contracting. And yes, not just time or place, but character and interactions and revelations and, life and death itself.
Yeah, I would say I'm also writing a novel currently. I was writing the novel before I ever was writing the short stories, but like the novel is sprawling. It feels like a really obvious thing to say that novels are big, but they are. And there's something where it's just like, if you're going from writing short stories where, you're having to do all of this work, as you say, like all this emotional weight and character weight in these really short spaces, usually like my stories tend to be somewhere between 15 and 20 pages, but I'm trying to depict a whole world, like a fully three-dimensional person. But so every line has its own weight. And when I was writing this novel at first, in the first draft, I sent it to my agent and she was like, hey, you can slow down, actually. There's actually time for you to kind of meander a little bit. And I was like, oh, what is that like? And so I guess my answer is that I don't really know why one thing becomes a short story or one thing calls for you to write a novel. I'm still trying to figure that out. But I know that they're entirely distinct forms, contrary to people's belief where it's like, oh, the short story is a precursor to a novel. No, they're very separate forms that require very different tools. I'm still figuring that out. I hope to actually complete a novel and then maybe have an answer for that. But from what I've heard from other writers is that every novel or every book is going to require you to like start at square one anyway. So It's kind of just like, okay, just getting comfortable with the process of being uncomfortable and figuring out the form and time and all of that stuff, I guess. I feel like I didn't answer the question at all, but like, that's all I got for that.
No, I think you absolutely did. I mean, I'm interested also in, can you see the end of a novel when you started? I mean, Lydia, it sounds like your process is in pieces, regardless of which form it ends up being. But I wonder, Amber and Dantiel, whether you feel like you can see to the end of the novel, or is that not a characteristic of that?
I think no for me. I mean, and which is interesting because, like Dantiel, I tend to have an end a lot of times in mind when I have a short story. I don't always know how it's going to end, but I usually have a pretty good idea. And yeah, with the novel, I've written a couple, and I mean, one of them turned into a novella and the other one just died. But so this is actually the third one. But each time I had no idea how where it was going. I'm definitely not a like outline writer, or at least not until the book is like, well into its, second or third draft, and then I can kind of start to plan. But no, it's like, it's almost like, this large space that we're talking about, you almost need, it's like, to me, I almost need the space to just be able to shift and change and sort of play and explore in that space in a way that, not to say that I wouldn't play or explore in a short story, but I think because it is just a shorter, is a shorter piece, you sort of have to know what you're doing a little bit more going into it. I think you have to have the parameters have to be a little bit, I think, for me anyway, more set.
Yeah, I would say that just like with the short stories for me, I do have an ending in mind, but the difference for me so far in writing the novel versus the short stories is that these characters, the more that I was writing through the first draft, the more that I was understanding about the characters. So by the time I got to like the end of that draft, the things that I had them do in the beginning, I was like, well, they wouldn't have done that. And I didn't know that because I had to get to the end of the novel to know that. And so I feel like, yeah, I still kind of have a place where I'm like, okay, this is, I think, where we're getting off the train, but it may be a different stop. It may not look like what I'm looking like, because now I'm in my second draft and it's like, but I'm still learning about them. It's like spending time with people. So I'm not really sure yet if the ending is going to be earned. And if not, then I'll, figure out what that looks like, because I'll have known them hopefully enough by then to figure out what feels right to get off at.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you all. So I'm interested also in how you came to be writers of short stories. Was this something that you always had an ambition to do? How did you come to this particular artistic pursuit and this particular form? And then maybe if I can add on like a second somewhat related question, how did your collections come to be?
I'm going to say workshop. I didn't even know you could be a short story writer until I started taking writing classes. Like, I've been wanting to be a writer, but I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to write a book. But I guess a book was like the novel, but like not having any definition. But it was just basically taking workshops and, that's what you got assigned, or you know what I mean? And then we were reading short stories and fiction writing classes and that kind of thing. But like, it wasn't something that I was like, yeah, I'm going to be the great American short story writer. It just, I like them. And I think that they're really fun to write. And there's something that I get about them. There's something about it that's illuminating for me in that form, whereas like I have to try a little harder at the novel.
I didn't come out of the chute saying I'm going to be a short story writer either, for sure. And in case anyone who eventually hears this, if anyone, I am a person who came to writing, and particularly short stories, through trauma. And I had been writing fragments coming out of a psychosis situation, like in a journal. And the fragments weren't anything except me trying to find a way to make order again in my lived experience. And so later in life, those fragments were very educational for me, because instead of hating them as a sign of when I wasn't well, I understood that they were storytelling motions trying to heal me, and I was trying to heal myself. And so I too landed in workshops eventually, but the storytelling form in short bursts was what helped put shape and form back into my world and life, and probably saved my ass, to be honest with you. And so that's a little bit of an overdramatic answer, but in case anybody's out there, in some form of crisis or struggle, it can help reflect order and form back to you and give some shape and meaning, both reading them, as Danielle was saying, but also beginning to write them. It can bring form where it feels like there isn't any.
Well, I was a poet. and a not a good poet, and a songwriter, actually, a singer-songwriter. And so I was, I was actually, I started out like doing songwriting, and then I was like, oh, I'll write poetry. How hard could that be? And so I was studying poetry. I know, right? I was studying poetry in college, and my professor, one of my professors, kept really nicely trying to tell me that I should write short stories. And I was like, I don't know why he keeps telling me this. Because all of my poems were essentially short stories, or trying to be short stories. So eventually, I thought, okay, well, I'll take a short story course. And, we read, Lori Moore. I was like, okay, you know what, this is what I want to do. Actually, I want to write this. And I have not written a single poem since then, actually. Maybe I'll try to go back to it someday, but probably not. Yeah, I think I in particular really like the form, like, and this is actually something, not to go back to the novel, but that's something that's hard for me writing a novel as opposed to short stories. Is my favorite thing about writing short stories is playing with form, and doing a lot of experimenting with different kinds of, form, and with time, and with structure, and all these things. And I think you can be a lot more playful in a short story in some ways than you can be very playful in a novel, but it's sort of a little bit more, it's harder to sustain.
Okay, yeah.
So I think, over a longer period of time, right? It's like it would get tedious like if you were, people have written whole stories as a list, but I think, or whole books, but that's hard to maintain. So for me, I think it was just like fun. Like, honestly, I was just like, this is really fun. And I felt like I was doing these little like science experiments, and I never actually thought I was like going to get published or anything, because I was an actor at the time. And so I was like, oh, this is like a thing I'll do for fun. Because acting was hard and terrible, and writing was actually really fun. So, and then I just kind of kept writing and writing. And then, like, at some point when I was like, 30, I was like, oh, I guess I could try to publish some of these things. And, that was that.
It's really interesting to me that all of you came circuitously to this form. Like, it wasn't the first thing that you set out to do. And so, then, sort of in the process of producing the work that went into your collections, at what point did you feel, oh, I think I have a book here? And how did the book take shape? And I'm interested particularly, in the question of ordering the stories. Sort of how did you decide, okay, this is the shape I want the book to have as a whole? Because it's not necessarily, it's not a given, right, with a short story collection necessarily.
Yeah, so it actually took me quite some time. Like, it's hard to remember precisely, but I feel like I had 4 or maybe 5 stories before I realized what I had was possibly a collection. Because at first, to me, and people have read the book and they're like, oh yeah, these are really distinct stories. But in my head, when I was writing, I was like, you're doing the same story over and over, and you're just like changing character names. And then I had to stop and kind of think and be like, wasn't that what a collection does? Doesn't it take like a certain question or obsession or whatever you have, and it kind of puts it in these different worlds to be explored at different angles by different characters who have these different worldviews? And so once I kind of got into my head, like, it's okay for this question to kind of keep coming up, even though there was a question I was kind of writing to, and then there was a secret question that came after I had all of the stories, and I was like, oh, here's this other thing that I was writing toward and I didn't know it. But it took me a little bit. And then after that, once you have all of your stories, for me, some writers are like, oh, the order is very like natural in their head. For me, it wasn't. I was like, well, I know that they're linked, even though most people ideas of linked collections have more to do with the characters being the same, which I think is not very is very limiting, because there's so many other things that constitute a link, like voice, theme, place, besides character. But I do think of it as linked. And so for me, it was just kind of like, okay, all of these stories exist separately, but together, how am I making that picture whole? How is that arc being completed? And so it was just kind of sitting down with my really lovely agent and editor and kind of being like, okay, what's the arc here and what makes the most sense? And again, true to form, I knew what story I wanted to end on, but everything else I was just kind of like putting into place. So yeah.
Was there anything that I'm sorry, I'm really curious to know, was there anything that your agent and editor said when you sat down with them that really surprised you about the ordering?
Actually, yeah, because in my head, I was going to start with this story outside the raft. And then, they were like, maybe that's a little quiet to start on. What about starting with Milk, Blood, Heat, which is the title story? And for me, I was kind of like, oh, that's a really intense story to start on. Do we want to just like get right in there? People are going to like maybe not read the book after they read that story. And that's probably true. Some people are probably like, nope, not for me. And that's okay too. But yeah, it surprised me that they were like, yeah, just go all in. Then it made sense afterwards, because it was kind of like, okay, I would want somebody to read this story and see what they're going to get into and still decide to come along for the journey anyway. You know what I mean? Like, not everything is going to make you feel like, oh, happy, joyous. I think sometimes being uncomfortable is really important to growth. And so like, if it's up front, this is what we're going to be doing, come along, or not, then it's all out there.
I'm pretty sure everything I've ever written has been in the category of discomfort. So, or that's what I'm told anyway. I think they're happy, jolly stories. I don't know why everyone's so upset. They make sense to me. But I love that whole answer. I give that answer a standing ovation. I identify with it too. I think what takes something for me from a pile of short things I've written to this might be a collection is when they start speaking to each other, when the pieces begin to move in and out around each other and speak to each other. And you already said this, so I'll just be saying it a different way. A kind of question or theme begins to develop around which they're moving. And not that they're the same, but that they're moving around center as spokes in a wheel or something. And it starts to feel like a gestalt or a form, with the smaller forms moving around inside it. And that I feel that in my body. I don't know if that's useful to tell any other human being, but I can feel it when they begin to have relationships with each other in my body. But I desperately need editors, because I always put things in an order that the editor is like, why would you do that?
Thank God for editors. Yeah.
I know.
For good editors. For good editors.
Yes, exactly. And in this particular collection, I would say really quickly that formally, it was a big experiment for me to have the stories that would make the whole, that were speaking to each other. And then there are these little tiny fragment stories of a woman kind of losing her marbles. And they're all really short and none of them resolve. And the women are really angry and they just come in and interrupt the form. And I'm not sorry. And that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think it's been a little bit different for each of my collections. So like, I think my first collection was more because I was writing mostly flash fiction. So, and I think it was more like the very unexciting thing of like, I wrote a lot of stories. I should probably put them in a book, and did that. And published it. But I think that was early on too, and in my writing career, and I wasn't really thinking as holistically. And I think for like since that time, particularly, I felt like there's sort of to echo what you guys are saying. I feel like it's done, or I have a book when there's like almost, doesn't sound mystical, but there's almost like almost an elemental feel to it that's unified. It's like there's fire or water, or there's some sort of it's weird. It's like not necessarily a tonal thing, but something slightly bigger than that sort of unifies all the stories. So when I was working on like Unfinished World, and I sent it to my editor, and I was kind of like, I think these are of a piece. I have, these are some of the things I've been working on. And she agreed, and we kind of pared it down together, sort of based on what did we decide? It was sort of a state of suspended animation, so that every story in the book would have to leave you in a state of suspended animation in some way. And so there aren't any stories in that book that are like too realistic or, you know, too grounded necessarily in realism. Though there's none that are just like straight up fantasy either. And then, you know, for the third book, it was for And I Do Not Forgive You. It was very much, I mean, that's a very angry book. I think fire for that book, 100%. And so, you know, I think I never intended to publish that as a book at all. And I was joking around with my editor, and I said, you know, I could send you guys this thing that, because I was like working on the novel, and, you know, I'm like, you'll see that in like 100 years. And I was like, but I could send you guys this thing that I've been putting together, a bunch of like random stories I've been writing over the years about how much I, you know, fucking hate Trump, and, you know, Me Too, and this kind of stuff. And sort of all these things about how angry I am to be a woman right now. And, or, you know, being a woman, how angry I am, not angry to be a woman. You know, my editor was like, are you serious? Like, yes, please send that. Like, lots of people will, I think, identify with that. And I was like, you know, it's like a really angry book. I don't know if you know, thematically, if people will want to read an entire book of stories that are just like pissed off. So I sent it over to her, and she was like, I think yes, like maybe not in normal times, but these are not normal times. And, you know, I think people might be okay with that. I mean, there's some of the stories are a little more hopeful and happy, I hope, but no, most of them are like unforgiving and revenge filled and angry. And so, you know, that was kind of how that came to exist. And there's a lot of stories actually that I've written that are never made it into a collection at all, because they don't fit tonally, or they don't fit this sort of like elemental theme of the book. And they end up just getting cut, and that's fine. Someday I'll publish a collection of all my like realist fiction that never makes it into anything.
Things anthology, like all of the darlings that you had to just toss aside.
Exactly. But yeah, ordering stories is like, honestly, I don't know if you guys have this. I hate it. I really have a hard time with it. And I'm like Lydia said, thank God for editors, because like I feel like my instincts are always wrong and bad as well. And I feel like the only thing that I've learned is just the cynical move of just put your like best show-stopping stories like right up front in the book. And which, you know, then I always feel like, well, shouldn't they all be like that? But you know, like, you know, your best stories. And I guess I always kind of felt like, well, shouldn't we save that? Like, shouldn't we like give them something to, you know, wait for, or to savor later as a dessert? And it was like, no, dude, you gotta just give it to them right away. Like, let them read that story. So yeah, it's hard though.
With
I also think it's useful for writers considering putting their own collections together to hold a question in your mind as you go, which is, does the order of the stories itself tell a story?
Yes, 100%.
And you can actually track that and draw it, or I'm very visual, so I make drawings of things, not outlines, but pictures. And they ought to. You ought to get to the end of a short story collection feeling like there was also a greater story, or stories that circled back or something. I think that would be a useful question to carry.
That resonates.
I did get like one of the most useful pieces of advice I ever got on ordering collections was actually from a friend of mine who is a writer, and she gave me the diving bell. I don't know if you guys like know what a diving bell is, but you know, she was like, you know, think about, and this may not work for every collection, but it worked really well when I took her advice for mine, for Unfinished World. It was like, she's like, you know, think of your stories as and you've started up here, and you've got the reader, and they're not necessarily like with you 100%, but they're like, they're there and they want to read the book, and then you bring them in, and then they get in the diving bell, and here's your stories, and you go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper until you're all the way down there, like 20 fathoms under the sea, and then halfway through the book, you start bringing them back up again until at the end of the book you're back at the surface level again. And I thought that was, I don't know, I've used that in a couple of my books loosely, and I find it very useful because I do like to be, I mean, as a reader, I like to be immersed in what I'm reading. And I think it is, I know not everybody reads short story collections that way, but I do tend to read them sort of immersively. So I found that useful.
I wonder if you have advice for writers who are currently just beginning to work in this form, either just starting out as writers, of short stories at all, or else, just beginning to put their work out into the world through submitting to magazines, and maybe also just starting to think about how they might go together as a book. What might you say to somebody in that situation?
Keep your day job.
Yeah.
Can I say that? No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, among other things.
Among other things, actually, yes. You're not going to get rich as a short story writer, that's for sure.
But also, I think it's really interesting how the industry treats short stories. And again, it has to be versus the novel because that's what it's always being compared to. But I think it's kind of this self-fulfilling prophecy of, oh, short stories don't sell, and then not putting the marketing and the visibility and the, all of that stuff behind the short stories. So in turn, they do not sell. I think that, that's maybe changing a little bit. And, the last few years, short stories are really doing it. They've always been doing it, but you know what I mean? It's that kind of like gap between readers who, just like us coming to it, weren't like, oh, short stories, you know what I mean? It's not like the form that's out there the most, but I think that if you're somebody who loves short stories, loves the form, wants to put together and sell eventually a short story collection, I think it's super important when you're thinking about agents and editors who understand and support that work for the short stories being the art that they are, and not as a vehicle for the novel. I think that's super duper important because then you won't have all this pressure. Because I know that when I was first talking to editors, it was like, I'm selling the short stories. I had said that, oh, I have a first draft of the novel, but I don't know when it's ready. But still the question was like, the novel though, what about the novel? What about the novel? And that's normal, and I get that. But at the same time, I ended up going with the editor who didn't ask me about the novel at all and was like, here's what I see about the stories. And for me, that was super important. I feel like too, you get like agents who, are like, oh yeah, I mean, if you're trying to sell a short story, you might want to get a newer, untested agent. And I also think that is false. I think that everyone's going to have their own, stance on short stories versus novels, but like find the people who are in your corner for the art that you're trying to make. I think
Yes.
it's the thing that I would say most important.
All of the yes.
Yes.
That, all of the yes. And can I add one thing alongside it? There are 100 paths to publishing, to getting agents, to making your writerly life. There are 100 different ways to have a writerly life. And all of the paths are open, and you have to kind of navigate where your people are that are going to support you and be for you, even if it's deciding on agents, or maybe you're not even going to have an agent and you're going to go small press route or indies or form community and practice art inside community. It's much more important to find the people who get passionate in the ways you do about what you're doing than it is to score the high-powered agent or publishing house, which may start trying to cleverly seduce you toward what they want you to write, which has happened to me. Luckily, I was like, that sucks, not doing that. But do you guys agree? I mean, isn't it more important to find?
Yes. 100 yeses.
Yeah, it's and it's funny too, because I always I actually always tell my story as like a little bit like hopeful for people, because I actually found so my I was unagented for my first collection, and then my agent actually found me through that collection, which was published on a small press, which was just like amazing luck. And he's fantastic. And it's funny because I didn't care about having an agent when he contacted me. So I was like, in fact, I was like, is this like a scam? So, one of the questions for him was, I don't like, do you care that I'm only a short story writer? Because that's what I'm going to do. And he was like, no, that's what I like about you. So, that was really, really important to me from the outset. Like, eventually, yes, of course, I been writing a novel, but that was never contingent. But it's funny because, after that, I did have this novel that I was trying to sell, and he was sending it everywhere and nobody wanted it. And, it got some near misses or whatever. And he sent it to my editor, who is now my editor, or who was actually my editor at Live Right. And she said, I like this fine, but I think she feels to me like a short story writer. Does she have a short story collection? Which is like not something that, presses ever say.
Normal, yeah.
So he was like, well, actually, yes, she does. And so, they sent over my short story collection, and that ended up being what was my second collection that they published, which was amazing. So, and it's funny because I've never, I've heard that from a lot of people, the whole, oh, are you writing a novel? Okay, that's great. You have a collection, but you also have to have a novel, or you need to submit both at the same time. But I feel like also that's, I mean, I in some ways never actually been true, but also like in the past few years, I hate to say there's like one turning point, but I want to say like Carmen Maria Machado's
I was
book.
just gonna say,
yeah, like that was the year
like
that
the
I was
turning point,
did
right?
a lot of work. Yeah.
Yeah,
and
like
there
that.
should be a T-shirt that says Carmen Maria Machado motherfucker in like parentheses, because that's just the new answer to any kind of shade about short stories.
I mean,
whatsoever.
yeah, it was her, and then it was Jamel Brinkley. I mean, it was like a year of short stories that year.
Friday Black, like
I was gonna say Nana's book
Yep.
came out, and then and so there's okay, so let's start changing our perceptions about what the short story can do in the market, and then actually allow people to just make good art.
That's
How about
right.
that?
That's right.
exactly. No,
it's
that's
coming.
exactly.
Hopefully we're getting there.
That's what I hope to. And now because I think also something that changed a lot is because there's just so many places to submit online. And I mean, obviously that's where people are submitting. I mean, for many years, not recently, but that's where it's at: online magazines, flash fiction, micro fiction, like short fiction. So, that's what more and more people, I think it used to be, when you'd get in like creative writing classes or whatever, it'd be like, okay, you're writing a novel or you're writing a memoir or whatever. But I feel like now so many like young writers that are starting out in short stories, because that's like what they're reading. It's what they're seeing online. It's what people are sharing. Like it's what like all these magazines are publishing. And so in some weird way, it actually feels like a renaissance back to, the golden age of the short story, except it's not all like white men.
Right. That's nice.
Actually like a really diverse and awesome time to be writing short stories. So
if you're someone who's trying to, where can I start putting my work? I mean, there's so many great literary magazines, either online or in print. And the biggest thing to understand about that is probably not a lot of people are reading these magazines, but a lot of people in the industry are, a lot of other writers are. And so that's a good way for just to get your work out there, at least in that way, so that you can, maybe connect with somebody who can help you get to that next level of visibility or whatever it is that your goals are for your writing.
Yeah. I mean, in a slightly related question, I think I had just about have time for this and maybe one other. I mean, one of the aspects of being a writer now, but maybe particularly a short story writer, is the digital world and and social media, and kind of sort of navigating the question of how much to be connected to that and how much not to be. And I wonder, I mean, also in the vein of advice for writers starting out, how do you think others can productively approach relating to that aspect of the writing life, the literary world?
Oh God. So can I go first?
Yeah.
So on the one hand, social media is a cesspool. I mean, just on one
Stop there.
on the surface. What I see so many emerging writers getting told, just hammered over and over again, is you have to have a platform, you have to network with this, you have to be in this binders group, you have to be in that binders, you have to be social media queen with a crown. And it's not true. And it in fact sucks a lot of your creative energy that you need to make your art, and siphons it off into these realms that are, you know, disguised as what they really are, is old forms of kind of shitty cocktail networking or little gossip dens. That's another horrible thing about them. So on the one hand, I hate that that's what new writers are being told, as if that's the only way to make your art and move into the world. There are good things about social media and ye old interneticals that have to do with, we can make faster bridges to people when we find someone whose work resonates or whose artistic life resonates. You can do that faster. You can share resources. You can warn each other faster. So there are some positive elements to the digital realm of networking. But I want to finish talking by saying just one thing. It's much more important to do good work in your micro community with actual people to live a literary life. And if anybody wants to be an author for real for their whole life, that's where some of your labor has to go. And this surface nonsense people try to push you into, it gets in the way. It keeps us from bridging to each other so we can do real work in the world. Okay, righteous diatribe over. Sorry.
No. I mean, I basically agree with that. I'm also of two minds, because I do think, I mean, as somebody who did not get an MFA and does not come out of a writing program, and didn't know any writers at all when I started, the internet is how I met writers and made community. And I think for a lot of writers, it's, especially, people who don't have the same kind of opportunities that, somebody who goes to, knows everybody in New York or whatever, and, went to some specific school, has, I think it is democratizing in a lot of ways, I think, because you do meet people, you do make those bridges.
Yeah.
And you do sort of find community, and like a lot of my community, like you're talking about the micro community, and I think that's exactly right. And I found a lot of that initially online, but it does suck away a lot of your time too. And I think, to me, it's less like, because I mean, I don't know if you guys, like, I'm on Twitter all the time, so I'm like a terrible example, but I think that, Roxane Gay always says, like, if you like it, if you like being there and you like doing it, then do it. Like, because then you'll be good at it, and then you'll like make friends naturally and have a community, and it's a natural fit for you, and it can only be helpful to you. But if you're like, I don't want to do that, and I hate it, and it's painful to me, and it takes away from my writing, like, then of course, it's not helpful, so don't do it. And it's just going to be, I mean, everybody sees the artificial people on Twitter or Facebook or whatever that are just like promoting themselves, and it's like super embarrassing, and you're just like, oh no. So I think, but I will say, I do think there is, I used to be like, oh no, you don't need that at all to like be a starting out writer, but I'm torn about that, because like, I think it's harder to find, depending on, where you go to school and all those sorts of things. But I think it is probably harder if you don't have any internet connections at all, or you're not part of an online community. It might be harder to kind of make some of those connections in publishing, or make some of those connections or just find like internet magazines that you can submit to, or that kind of thing. I think, it might just be a little bit harder to do some of that, but it's also true, I think, that when I talk to a lot of younger writers or just starting out writers, they're like, that they're sort of like more obsessed with starting a platform than with actually just sitting down and doing the work of becoming
Exactly.
a writer. And that's like, and it's like, yes, there's always examples of some person who, built a huge platform and sold a book, and that's how they sold it. But you know what? They were also a good writer. That's the thing. Like, you've got like, say, Brandon Taylor, for example, right? Like, somebody who I think what I've, has argued online that it helped him to have a huge platform, and it helped him to like, be very online and be an editor and make these connections, but also is just a fantastic writer and actually like did the work, right? So, that's ultimately the thing.
I would just add really quickly, because I agree, pros and cons to both. I would say that though, remember whether you choose to use it or not, however you're using, whatever you're choosing to say, the internet is not a void. It is a space where the writer world is still very small. It can seem really small on the internet when you have your little bubbles of people following you. So I would just say, and I tell all my students this, when you're using social media, if you have something really nasty or whatever to say, put that in the group chat. Tell that to your friends, because the writing world is very small and you may think that nobody sees that kind of stuff, but the people see it. And since the world is small, those people end up on search committees and contests and awards and all that kind of stuff. Either way, and just, kind of maintain a kind of positive or neutral energy on the internet towards people. Everyone has their snark, everyone has their opinions. That's totally great. And you can do whatever you want on the internet, but it's not a void. It's not a consequence-free space. You still have to own what the thing that you said. So just.
It's such a small world.
Use it wisely. Yeah.
It's tiny.
Thank you, guys. So one last really quick question before we finish up then. So I wonder if there are writers, who worked or who are working in the genre of the short story, whose work you particularly love or count as influences, and it could be somebody who was like the initial writer whose work you encountered and you're like, oh, this gives me permission to do what I had intuited I wanted to do, or just someone you came across recently whose work you found really inspiring, who's working in the short story form.
I've been trying to read more work out, like more translations, basically more work outside of the United States, just to like, not always be so entrenched in the bubble. But I just finished reading The Dangers of Smoking in Bed. And I also read Yoko Ogawa's Revenge. And I just feel like those are both short story collections. And I was just like, what Americans think is darkness is not what we're just testing the little limits of
that.
Yes. This is it's like, it's so exciting just to be like, okay, this is how other people are pushing elsewhere and how their culture is informing their work. And it's just really inspiring to see that, because as someone who gets told all the time, like, oh, your stories are very dark, I was like, yeah, but they're not without light. I'm doing both. I'm doing duality, but it's really nice to see that. So those are some stories that I've been really blown away by, and just like what the form can do and what you can talk about. Like my favorite thing about short stories, I think, is getting to that very deep down human place that people want to avoid. But I'm like, let's look at it some and like see where it correlates with our lives. And so it's really cool to see how people in other countries are handling that human darkness. Yeah.
I love you. Go. Yes. Revenge is so good.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I think, there's like, this is always the hardest question to answer, because there's like, I want to name drop like everybody. I think Kelly Link was somebody who like initially, I think for the give you permission sort of question, like when I was, just kind of testing the waters of like what a short story can actually do and where it can go and how weird it can get. I started reading Kelly Link's collections and, read the story Stone Animals, and was just like blown away by like what you can just end a story like that. Oh my God, I had no idea. I think also Danielle Evans, Before You Suffocate Your Own Fool Self. I read that book, and I was just like, oh my gosh. She has a new book out that's fantastic, but like, I was like, okay, short story collections, like they can do this. That is amazing. Like, this is so cool. And definitely sort of gave me a sense of freedom. in being able to, and just really in the last few years too, there's just been so many writers that have been, which I think coincides really nicely with sort of this, what we're talking about, the growing popularity of the genre, because more people are just going, okay, I'm just going to do whatever the hell I want in a short story. And, and it's like Carmen Maria Machado, right? Like it's great. Just reading all these really like fresh, interesting authors and ideas and influences just coming from everywhere.
Well, those are, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. Those are amazing writers. I think we all three have mentioned Carmen like 5 times now. So clearly we think Carmen blew something open. I do remember the first short story that brought me to my knees, and I think I was about 23 years old, was Sonny's Blues. And I've read it probably every year since. It still brings me to my knees, James Baldwin. And then someone whose work is really fascinating me lately is Tommy Orange. His book, There, he's doing something so interesting with the form of the short story and non-resolution. And there's this fascinating kind of decolonization move going on with the very act of telling, and how oral telling and written telling are making a helix. So I'm still puzzling on that. I'm still studying that book and looking at its forms. Very nuanced, very subtle. But these writers are all amazing.
Thank you. Those are great and fascinating answers. I mean, I think that's about all, unfortunately, we have time for, because I would love to listen to you all talk more about short stories. I guess, just to finish up. So thank you to the listeners again for joining us for She Sells Short Stories. We're so pleased that you spent the time with us, and we hope the discussion has been valuable. Be sure to check out 1455 Literary Arts at www.1455litarts.org to learn more about the organization and the free programming offered throughout the year. Thank you again so much to all of our guests. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This concludes the 4 p.m. session of Track 3, Craft and Community, entitled She Sells Short Stories. 1455 would like to again thank our sponsors and panelists for their support and participation in the 2021 1455 Summer Festival. In a moment, we will be ending the live stream. Before we go, we encourage you to check out and purchase books from today's speakers. Purchasing a book or two is a great way to support our authors and speakers who have donated their time to be here today, and to support a local independent bookstore. Please visit the 1455 website at 1455litarts.org/summerfest-books, where you'll find a listing of books organized by author last name, with links to purchase from our independent bookselling partner, the Potter's House. Finally, the Summer Festival doesn't end with this session. We encourage you to use the links above this screen to navigate back to the Attendee Hub and join one of our upcoming sessions, or check out any of our earlier sessions you may have missed that are available for on-demand viewing. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the festival.